everyone. Can you hear me? Everybody's good? All right. Well, welcome to this edition of the Politics and Policy Lunch. I'm Neil Harris. I'm the program manager for the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy. Our guest speaker today is Professor of Political Science, Corey Brettschneider. Corey Brettschneider is a professor of political science here at Brown, where he teaches constitutional law and political theory. He is the author of the new book, The Presidents and the People, 5 Leaders Who Threatened Democracy and the Citizens Who Fought to Defend It, which is called Essential and Invaluable by the Publishers Weekly. He is also the author of The Oath in the Office, A Guide to the Constitution for Future Presidents, which Kirk has called Vital Reading for All Americans. His other books include When the State Speaks, What Should It Say?, How Democracies Can Protect Expression and Promote Equality, and Democratic Rights, the Substance of Self-Government. He is the editor of the series Penguin Liberty and the author of numerous articles in top political science journals and law reviews, including the American Political Science Review, Political Theory, and the Texas Law Review. His constitutional law casebook is widely used in classrooms throughout the United States. Brettschneider's writing has appeared in The Guardian, The New York Times, Politico, and The Washington Post. He holds a PhD in politics from Princeton and a JD from Stanford Law School. And without further ado, Professor Corey Brettschneider.
Thanks for that, Michelle. Thanks everyone for coming. Good to see a lot of familiar faces. I'm going to talk for about 25 minutes and outline the argument of the book, and then mostly we'll have discussion. And if you want to buy a book, there's one outside, but you could wait in here, what I have to say first. Let's just start with the thing that happened the day before the book came out. It came out July 2nd and July 1st. The Supreme Court announced its immunity decision. So in the immunity decision, as I think a lot of you know, what the court said was not just that a sitting president, but a former president cannot be prosecuted for official acts committed while in office. That was a huge deal. It really stripped a lot of the accountability that we expect or might have thought from courts over a president, especially the idea that no person in this country is above the law, the idea that's supposed to be behind U.S. versus Nixon. So the book's thesis got a lot of attention because it really fits into what the court did. The idea of the book is both a warning, but it also is going to offer some hope. So let me say something about the warning first. The warning is that the traditional checks on the office of the president have not worked throughout American history. And let me say what I mean by that. The first check that many of the framers envisioned in Federalist 78, for instance, is the court. That if a president acts contrary to law, we have a system of laws enforced by courts, and pretty simple, the courts are supposed to enforce the law. The idea of judicial review, in particular, when a president acts unconstitutionally or illegal in some way, that the courts would have oversight. And yet the immunity decision is one way that thesis that I have, that this check hasn't worked, seems to be supported. The other check that the framers envisioned, the traditional kind of check that you learn about in grade school, is impeachment. That a president who abuses power is supposed to be susceptible to impeachment and removal for high crimes and misdemeanors. But one of the arguments of the book is that hasn't worked either, even in the 19th century when it was really called for in the presidency of Andrew Johnson. What all of this suggests is that there's a kind of warning at the founding. Patrick Henry, who some of you have heard about because he said, "Give me liberty, give me death." He was a revolutionary hero. But he also is less known for the fact that he predicted what I'm saying. He says at the founding, don't ratify this Constitution. He was against it. Because if you ratify it, what you're going to do is enable the collapse of anything resembling democracy. And the collapse is going to happen the following way. That a sitting president, it's assumed, is going to be a good person, a person of virtue. What if you get a bad person in office? And I'll now use Henry's language. He says, what if you get a criminal president? in office, here's what's going to happen. This is Henry's prediction before ratification, warning against it. What's going to happen is that person is going to realize they have all sorts of power, including the power to pardon their close associates who are involved in their crimes, co-conspirators. And they're going to, far from feeling checked, feel aggrandized in that power. Now, here's the wild thing that he says. So much so that that person won't hesitate to crown themselves, and this is his quote, a monarch. Now, that might have seemed like an exaggeration for a lot of American history. But if you look closely, this is the argument of the book, it's not an exaggeration. There really are very weak checks on power. And part of the argument of the book is that we have had presidents opposed to the basic ideas of democracy and power throughout American history, and I'm going to talk about 5 specifically. They haven't had the traditional checks on them work. But now here's the hopeful part. There has been a way that American democracy has survived and even recovered more strongly than it existed before, and it's not through the court. In fact, I'm going to argue the court always makes things worse, or at best, in a couple of cases, like it's sort of neither here nor there. It certainly never saves democracy. And impeachment, as I said, doesn't work. So what does work? What works, and this is the hopeful part of the book, are citizens who try to reclaim a democratic idea of the Constitution. And they don't just speak out, although that's part of it, against what I call crisis presidents, specifically presidents who have adopted an authoritarian idea of the Constitution and acted on it. But what these citizens do is reclaim a democratic idea against those presidents, but they don't go to court. That's not their technique. They form what I argue are democratic constitutional constituencies around recovery presidents. And that this has happened in each of the clusters that I'm going to talk about. The idea is the Constitution is vague, right? And so authoritarian presidents have been able to read in. I mean, Trump is sort of the most obvious example in him saying, I have an Article 2, it gives me the ability to do anything I want. And these other presidents have been more subtle about it, but they've also had authoritarian ideas of the Constitution. And what these citizens have done is fought back by saying, no, you're wrong. There is this democratic idea as opposed to your idea. And then they've used politics, putting their power and constituent power behind these recovery presidents. And then, this is the key, holding them to account to ensure that they really do recover a democratic idea of the Constitution. So that's the thesis, that you should worry about the presidency because Henry's right, the traditional checks don't work. And not only can we have a bad person in power, a criminal president, but we've had lots of dangerous presidents before. And yet the hopeful part is I'm saying there is a check, not the one the framers envisioned, but a democratic check of these citizens pushing back. So let's start with early in the founding. George Washington, by the way, gives in the second inaugural a very different idea of the presidency from the one that's about to happen from Adams. He says, I just took the oath of office. It puts the law above me. And if I violate it, I want the people assembled, the people of the United States, to upbraid me, criticize me, and even subject me to constitutional punishment. That's the shortest inaugural ever given, 235 words. But listen to what John Adams does quickly after that. He takes power, and as he's starting to see criticism mount, he's going to really give an idea of the Constitution and act on one that is not just authoritarian, but monarchical. And his reflected view was that the King of England actually had too little power. And so he wanted more power even than the British king. And he analogized the idea of the president not being accountable to we the people. He thought sovereignty wasn't the basis of the presidency, but stability. So when the Federalists hatch a plot, and this is going to sound, as many of these things will, eerily familiar, to form a committee in Congress that will deny the certification of electoral votes in order to push the issue to the House of Representatives, where the Federalists are convinced that they can beat the Democratic Republicans, their rival, because according to the Constitution, you vote state by state. That plot is hatched and actually discussed on the floor of the House and the Senate. And what happens is that newspaper editors start to publish what was happening. They uncover the plot, it's revealed, and it's squashed. But Adams and his party have not had enough. They passed the Sedition Act, partly to punish the editors. And what the Sedition Act says is that if you criticize the President of the United States, you're subject to a criminal offense. But if you criticize the Vice President, this gives you an idea of how it's set up. If you criticize the Vice President, who at the time is Thomas Jefferson, a member of the opposition party, that's fine. They're gerrymandering the law as a shutdown of the opposition party. And many fans of Adams, and there's a mini-series about him, a book by McCullough and others, have really minimized the extent to which these prosecutions really were an attempted and almost complete shutdown of the opposition party. The numbers have sometimes been talked about, in the teens, basically, or a little more. But it's over 126 prosecutions we now know, including the prosecution not just of opposition newspaper editors, but of a sitting Congressman, Matthew Leon. So why can't these editors just go to court? That's the, First Amendment, free speech. The First Amendment's been ratified. Go to court and say this is unconstitutional and the court should strike it down. That's the way we learn constitutional law now. But far from that being a possibility, Samuel Chase, one of the most influential Supreme Court justices of the time, lobbies for the Sedition Act and then goes and sits on the trial of some of these editors to ensure not only that they're convicted, but they can't raise a free speech claim. So it's not going to be in court. Certainly Congress is not going to impeach and remove Adams. He's got more than enough votes there. His party is in charge. They passed the act after all. So what happens? The editors do something brilliant, and this strategy is going to be repeated in very different contexts and moments in American history. They use their own trials to put Adams on trial. And they say, look, we have a right to free speech. What Adams and his party are saying is, all that means is what it meant in England, that you can't ahead of time stop publication. There's no prior restraint. That's the Federalist understanding of free speech. And the editors say, that can't be what it means. In a democracy, we the people, it has to mean a right to dissent, to criticize even the President of the United States. It's a deeply controversial idea. They're not going to win that idea in court. So they turn the election of 1800. They use the fact that Jefferson's not going to be out campaigning. He gave like one speech. It didn't go well. And they use that fact to turn the election of 1800 into a kind of referendum on the democratic constitution as opposed to the authoritarian one. And they argue that if you elect Jefferson, that will be a vindication of the right to dissent. And so when Jefferson says in the first inaugural, we're all Federalists, we're all Republicans, one of the most famous lines in presidential history, the context is he's saying we're not going to prosecute dissenters. He allows the Sedition Act to expire. Jefferson, of course, is a hypocrite and reprehensible in many ways. Of course, his views on slavery, which I'm going to talk about very soon, are a part of it. But it's also that he secretly does seek the prosecution of his opponents quietly. But the norm has started to be established, that there is this right to dissent. And it's really during the Madison presidency, even in the midst of an actual war in 1812, when his own party, including many of the editors who were originally prosecuted by Adams, are calling for a new Sedition Act. And they're saying, look, this is a different time. It's actual war. Prosecute your opponents. He refuses to do so. There is this idea of a right to dissent. And that's going to drive, America is not close to a democracy at this time. It's maybe at best a proto-democracy. But without multi-party democracy, without this right to dissent, the engine of change, the engine of resistance to authoritarian presidents can't get going. So I'll move to the second phase. The presidency of Buchanan is framed by a fake kind of modesty. He's out saying, he says, actually, his first inaugural address, the country is facing an issue about enslavement, and I'm going to just look to the Supreme Court. That's what the Federalist Papers say. That's how the system works. The Supreme Court's going to decide this issue with no input from me. And Frederick Douglass and others from the beginning realized this is a lie. And now we know, through extensive evidence, that it was an extreme lie. Actually, what Buchanan was doing at the same time as proclaiming his neutrality is lobbying the Supreme Court, as Dred Scott is about to be decided, to decide it in the most extreme evil way possible, a way that they do decide it. Buchanan's view, and this is echoed by the court, is that Black Americans have no rights, no legal personhood, no status at all under the federal Constitution. In fact, the way it's put is that Black Americans are not even citizens under the federal Constitution. Now, that becomes the law of the land, and within abolition, there's a dispute. How are we going to resist Buchanan and Dred Scott? The dominant view, the Garrisonian view of the Constitution is, obviously, this document is, Dred Scott in a way is morally evil, but it's legally right. And the Garrisonians say because the Constitution itself is evil. And so we should abandon it. Frederick Douglass, in a smaller wing, but I'm going to argue more important wing of abolition, says a very different thing. He says the decision is not just morally wrong, it's legally wrong. And Buchanan is, of course, morally wrong and legally wrong for doing it. Why? He turns to the preamble. This is one of many arguments. I'll give you several. And he says if you read the Constitution in the right way, for its broad principles and according to its text, you'll see that it's actually a democratic document. One that hasn't been redeemed yet, but one that can be redeemed. The phrase, we the people, this is just one of his many examples, doesn't say in its text, we the white people. And yet that's exactly how Buchanan and the Dred Scott Court are reading it. The word slave does not appear in the Constitution because it is not a document that protects the enslavement of other human beings. And then Douglass gives what's perhaps his most important argument, although all these arguments, I'll give you actually one more and then his most important one. He says, for instance, the corruption of blood in the Constitution, the ban on inheriting the punishments, the crimes of parents. If you read that as a principle, what is that but a ban on slavery? And then he says, and this is what I think of, it's a hard call, but I think of this as his most important argument. He says that if you understand, too, the Declaration as the framing document to understand the Constitution, then you see the Declaration's commitment to a principle unqualified of equality has to be the way we read the whole thing. Now, unlike the election of 1800, it's not the case that when Lincoln is elected, this is an ally of Douglass. In fact, Douglass is a huge critic of Lincoln early in his presidency, not just in his public speeches, but in his writings. And he has to flee, by the way. Buchanan isn't just, see him as a danger and as an opponent. He is there's an attempt to prosecute him. And so Douglass, in a sort of dramatic escape through Canada, makes his way to the UK, where he's making a lot of those arguments that I just gave you about how to read the Constitution. That's what his speeches are about. And those speeches, and as he comes back during Lincoln's presidency, he believes it's safe, those speeches and others, which he's continuing to publish in the UK, are calling out Lincoln as a kind of Buchanan. They're not exactly the same, but he thinks that he has many of the same flaws. And here's Lincoln's view at this time. Lincoln thinks that slavery is protected within the states, that Dred Scott is wrong, but it should be enforced, at least in some narrow way, that the Fugitive Slave Act is wrong, but it should be enforced. And Douglass is pushing back by saying that gets the Constitution wrong. In fact, Lincoln's idea of the Constitution is very legalistic, that there's a difference between law and morality. It sounds a lot like the Dred Scott Court. And Douglass doesn't stop pushing, partly in lectures, in what he's saying abroad. And there's a politics to this, too, because the UK hasn't decided where it's going to enter the war. And if the war, after all, this is Douglass's reasoning, is not about slavery, why not enter on the side of the South? And Lincoln's very worried about that this argument is making its way to what should be the Union's allies. So Douglass continues this relentless argument. Part of what he says, and I think one of the most effective things that he says, is that Lincoln is willing to get rid of all sorts of aspects of the legalistic parts of the Constitution. The right to trial, for instance, for the broader purpose of the war. Why not make the war, this is his way of putting it, about the most important moral issue and legal issue facing America. Make the war about slavery. That's what he's pushing as Lincoln's resisting. Douglas meets famously with Lincoln twice in the White House, and their arguments, their discussion, are in many ways just echoing the broad philosophical constitutional differences that I'm suggesting. He says to him, for instance, that his sons are Union Army and are not being paid equally. And how can that be consistent with the democratic idea of the Constitution? He's talking both at a broad level, but also at a policy level. And he starts to convince Lincoln on the issue of pay. Lincoln says he's going to do something. He arranges for Douglas to meet with military officials to do something about this issue. It's not yet that he's changed his mind. But the argument of the book is that over time, as we get to the end of the Lincoln presidency, he's moving much closer. The most famous speech in American history is the Gettysburg Address, or one of them. And what is that except for this idea of a government by and for the people, making it clear that the war is being consecrated by this moral idea, and the idea that he's increasingly referencing, including in that speech, of the Declaration framing the Constitution. These are really Douglas's ways of thinking that Lincoln is starting to move to. When Lincoln, shortly before the assassination, he does come out, not just, of course, for ratification of the 13th Amendment, passage of it, but for the idea, at least for soldiers, of the right to vote. And so Douglas is starting to see his ideas moving forward. But he's not satisfied by any means. He says, actually, in a eulogy for Lincoln, for a memorial, that he was a white man's president, meaning he came away from Buchanan significantly, but in no way was that presidency a full recovery. The Grant presidency is Douglas's moment. Douglas, all along from the beginning, is stressing an idea of equal protection. That's his phrase. It makes its way into the 14th Amendment. But even a more fundamental idea than equal protection is equal citizenship, a right to vote. He thinks that's the key to recovery of basic rights in the United States. Why? Because it's only with a right to vote that Black Americans are going to be able to protect themselves from the massive terrorism that's being brought against them throughout the United States by the Ku Klux Klan and other white terrorists. And so Douglas's idea from the beginning is not just that we need a 15th Amendment guaranteeing a right to vote regardless of race, but that there has to be an ability to enforce that right through laws that allow for the prosecution of the Klan and other white terrorists. And those laws, which he's really, from the Buchanan presidency earlier, been advocating for, become Grant's signature moment. His signature legislation is what's known as the Enforcement Acts, including the Ku Klux Klan Act, which enables the newly formed Department of Justice to prosecute over 1,000 white terrorists throughout the United States on the grounds that it's protecting the right to vote. And these aren't ideas that come from presidents in isolation. They come from Douglas and meetings that he's holding again and again, some of them large, some of them small, calling to account Lincoln in that initial moment, but eventually really the Grant presidency. The Grant presidency comes on the heels of a president who Douglas tried to work with, Andrew Johnson, who declares himself a Moses to Black people and really rejects everything that Douglas had claimed. And yet, even in the midst of this presidency, Douglas is able, with his constituency, to move these ideas forward. Johnson, of course, is impeached, not removed. That's not the thing that does the trick. It's instead the election of 1868, the election that really is the equivalent of 1800, and that it's a referendum on democracy, a referendum on these ideas of the right to vote, free from the threat of white terrorism. That is an important recovery, the recovery that's famously called Reconstruction, and told it in a way that's really focused on a constitutional recovery of a democratic idea. But things, of course, despite that recovery, are going to get there's going to be a new crisis of democracy. And one of the things I did in the book is it's well known now that Woodrow Wilson resegregated the federal government and that he showed Birth of a Nation in the White House. But what I did was I wanted to know much more than that. Like, what was the constitutional philosophy of Woodrow Wilson? And so what I did in researching the book was go into it. I had heard about the existence of these notebooks, and then I went and found them. But a Princeton librarian saved all of Woodrow Wilson's students' notebooks. And in these leather-bound, some of them notebooks, you get a real window into what this philosophy was. These weren't just ad hoc decisions about segregation and showing the film. They, at least this is the argument of the book, are a reflection of a deep ideology, not just of white supremacy, that wouldn't be a new crisis, but of nationalism combined with white supremacy. The argument of the book is that he really is the first white nationalist president in a quite distinct philosophical sense, and I'll say why this is the case. Wilson's idea is that the presidency is not he's not a member of an equal branch. He rejects explicitly Washington's way of thinking about things. He thinks the president's the only person elected by all the American people and has a special power to do the thing that the national government needs to do. And that's act efficiently. And what is the debate? And he gets many of these ideas from Germany, from Bismarck. National efficiency is the goal. What's the enemy of efficiency? He calls it friction. And that's a word that appears throughout the lecture. And what he means by friction is integration. And throughout his presidency, throughout the lectures, you see this word coming up again and again. And when he talks about Reconstruction, about Douglas's amendments, I say in the book, and I've been saying publicly, by the way, that moment Douglas reclaims the Constitution as the true founding of the democratic idea of the American Constitution. And it's one that Wilson just rejects entirely. In fact, the notes say that he not only disparages the 13th Amendment ending slavery, the 14th Amendment creating equal protection, the 15th Amendment creating a right to vote, but he argues that those amendments didn't add a single right to the Constitution. They just left it up to the states, which remained sovereign, to decide on those rights. So he gets rid of civil rights in the Constitution, fought over that crisis that I've described, and stresses the power of the president to nationalize efficiency, meaning anti-integration. Now, this was not part of what I'm arguing in the book, is this might be news to many of us now, but it wasn't news at the time to at least the most important, still nascent part of the civil rights movement. And I talk about William Monroe Trotter and Ida B. Wells calling Wilson out for all of this. That was not news to them. They went to the White House and they used this moment of finding out about the resegregation of the federal government. It had been desegregated and Wilson quietly was doing it again. They found out about it. He at first claimed it was a mistake, but in their second White House meeting, Wilson just, in an almost you can't handle the truth moment, comes out and says, "You, sir," to Trotter, "are creating friction. All I'm doing," and Trotter is saying, "No, you're creating a system of second-class citizenship." And Wilson's response is, if you see second-class citizenship in my reduction of friction, my pursuit of efficiency, that's something you're imposing on the idea of separation or segregation. He's echoing Wilson, the argument of Plessy versus Ferguson, but he's now also nationalizing it. Birth of a Nation and the cultural parts of it are not just a side part of what Wilson is doing. In fact, Birth of a Nation is based on the Klansman, which was written by a classmate of Wilson from Johns Hopkins when he was doing his PhD in political science. And if you read Wilson's 4-volume textbook, which was a popular textbook at the time, it's part of how he made money. He was president of Princeton, professor, and also had this role as a writer of popular history. Many of the scenes are just taken from it, taken from the textbook. That's not a coincidence, right? This is his good friend from Hopkins looking at one of the main sources for understanding the 19th century and then putting it into this film, which really is an apology for the Ku Klux Klan and even celebration of them. And the scenes parallel one another. The recovery this time takes decades. Trotter actually, in a tragic way, kills himself. He dies despondent. But the argument of the book is it's not Brown. That's the thing that's often pointed to in popular history. Brown is the moment where segregation is reversed. But I tell the story of the NAACP's strategy in going to Harry Truman soon after the war and telling the stories of black soldiers being murdered and hurt violently as they returned. And they're able to use these stories. I think Walter White in particular, who's doing a lot of the talking in this meeting, is surprised that Truman is actually moved. And at that moment is willing to say, well, what should I do? And Walter White is ready with a strategy. He recommends the appointment of a committee, a civil rights committee, that will create an agenda for recovery from Wilson. Now, we've heard certainly of Douglass, possibly of William Monroe Trotter. I think probably Ida B. Wells. I also talked about she was in these delegations with Trotter, walking hand in hand with him to oppose Wilson. But you likely haven't heard of Sadie Alexander, the first black woman to receive a PhD from UPenn and a law degree. Also, she had. And in this committee, she's able to do something quite brilliant, which is take this committee that it's unclear it's going to be anything, and use it as a way of announcing an agenda for recovery across three branches. What's immediately done is the undoing of Wilson's segregation of federal government through an executive order, the desegregation of the military. The committee at Alexander's behest recommends that, and Truman acts on them. The calling for, and she's working with Thurgood Marshall, who she's friends with and has worked with before and has testified for the reversal of Brown. But the most important thing that she does, the thing that works more than anything in desegregating America's public schools, is she announces the idea that becomes Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, that you need to use financial incentives, both carrots and sticks, to require the integration of America's public schools, and under threat that if America's public schools don't integrate, that money will be withdrawn, and if there is significant progress, it should be. And political scientists who study the issue, Brown, of course, is an important case, but this is the thing that really works. She creates it right here in the Civil Rights Committee. And in fact, it's so controversial that it's voted down. And she's able to use her relationship. This is how quietly but important what she did was. She's able to use her relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt, who she's become friends with, to lobby her son, FDR Jr., to switch his vote. And that's how this idea, what becomes Title VI, gets into the report. It has to be reprinted. I talked too, and there's not time to go into it, but the way that Martin Luther King evolves from really a natural law thinker to one who's thinking about the founding, the tradition of Douglass, recovering the idea of an anti-tyranny principle and using it to persuade Johnson, both in 1964, but importantly in 1965 in the Voting Rights Act. So there is, again, a real recovery, not one that's complete by any means, it's certainly one that's fragile, but there is a real recovery. The book ends with a president, maybe the most one that comes to mind when you think of previous presidents who threatened democracy, that we haven't recovered from. The book ends with Richard Nixon. I was fortunate enough to get one of the last interviews with Daniel Ellsberg a few weeks before he died about his role in all of this. And part of what I talk about in the book is that Nixon's crimes were so much more vast than Watergate. In fact, they were really almost entirely focused on, as Adams was, shutting down the opposition. And Ellsberg, who he continued to call the main ball, the main person in play, he saw him as the leader of this disloyal opposition. A lot of it was aimed at Ellsberg specifically in the movement he represented. And like Adams and like Buchanan, Nixon had a constitutional philosophy. He thought that America was in a civil war with people like Ellsberg, and that gave him immunity from crimes, and that he could legally create a unit, which he did, that was aimed at the shutdown of the opposition. And so when he says to David Frost, and again, one of the most famous lines ever uttered by a president, when the president does it, it's not illegal. That sounds like he slipped up or got frustrated. No, that is a deeply reflected view of the idea that as commander-in-chief in a civil war, the president has the ability to shut down the opposition. And he's in the tradition, certainly, of Adams. He claims he's in the tradition of Lincoln. We could talk about that. And yet there's resistance here, an attempted valiant resistance. By who? By average citizens of Washington, D.C., two of whom are still alive, who I had a chance to talk to for the book, And what these citizens did, these grand jurors from Washington, D.C., is they tried to indict Nixon for his crimes. In fact, in a straw poll led by Vladimir Prigel, the foreperson, a researcher at the Library of Congress, it included Harold Evans, a postal clerk, Elaine Edlund, who was a legal secretary. These were just a sampling of the population of D.C. They included Ethel Peoples, who was a janitorial worker, who was one of the people that I spoke to, and Patricia Woodruff, who had a number of low-paying jobs throughout her career. These unknown heroes voted, and as Edlund puts it, some of them with two hands, to indict Nixon. So what happened? What happened was that Leon Jaworski, the special prosecutor assigned to them, convinced them to back off at least temporarily. He said, if you do this, if you move forward with your indictment, in fact, an indictment was drafted by the attorneys working with the grand jury. If you do this, Nixon is going to surround the White House and have a coup, and you'll have prompted the destruction of American democracy. By the way, I also think he's immune, possibly, he didn't say definitely, but likely. And so what you should do is not indict him, just delay. I have a way of getting him out of office. If you delay, then we'll bring him down eventually from the presidency and indict him. So what's the plan? We'll give over all the information you have to Congress. This becomes known as the roadmap. We'll get the remaining 60-plus tapes that Nixon is hiding from us, including what became the smoking gun. That's U.S. versus Nixon. And once all this is over and he's resigned, we'll indict him. So the grand jury, Prigel included, go along with this. They hand over all the information to Congress. He's not impeached by the full House. He's voted in articles of impeachment by the Judiciary Committee, and then a committee is sent to advise him to resign, which he does. The tapes are a big part of that, including the smoking gun showing him admitting to the cover-up of Watergate, the Watergate break-in, a small component here. So Prigel goes back to Jaworski. He's like, we did our part. You did your part. It worked. Let's indict the President of the United States. And the crimes, by the way, are, again, so not just the crimes of Watergate, which they had the smoking gun on, but included, for instance, a plot totally unknown to kill Ellsberg on the Capitol steps that Nick Ackerman, one of the prosecutors I spoke to, was working on, which documents they now have, that he's released more generally, but hasn't gotten a lot of attention. And they included, evidence that we've known since, like Nixon's plot to blow up the safe in the Brookings Institution, which he says he wants done on a, quote, this is his words, thievery basis. So what happened? Prigel is demanding prosecution, and Philip Lacavara, the deputy in the office, meets with Jaworski. What are they going to do? They both come up with a plan. Let's just figure out what's going on with Ford. And Jaworski, in what's supposed to be like a reconnaissance mission, goes and meets with Al Haig, Ford's, at the time, chief of staff for a brief period of time. And what's supposed to be a finding out mission is quickly followed by the pardon. So you don't know any of these stories. Most Americans don't. Maybe the Watergate part, but not about the crimes at the Capitol steps or the crimes to use the IRS to go after political opponents, the enemies list, not the Brookings break-in, because it was all washed aside by the pardon. And so the argument of the book is that, unlike in those past moments, there really hasn't been a full citizens movement to recover the Constitution. And in fact, the crisis has just gotten worse with the day before the book's publication, the immunity case. Because a president really is placed above the law. There are things that could be done, laws to reverse the immunity case, but also there was for a brief period of time, and some of you have taken common law and know, an independent prosecutor law that not only would allow for prosecution of the president, but made that person not in the office controlled, the Department of Justice, by the president. Right now, the prosecutor who's supposed to prosecute a sitting president works for the president. It's a crazy idea. It's one that has a clear solution. But we haven't gotten there because partly, I think, the pardon's to blame. That we were denied the information that really could spark the kind of citizens movement. So I've given you hope, I hope, which is that it's not the courts that save us. That's nothing new. They make things worse. Think of Samuel Chase or the Dred Scott Court or Plessy. It's instead it's not impeachment. It's these citizens' movements that really get behind a candidate to recover a democratic idea of the Constitution. That's been done before. It could be done again. But it isn't enough to win an election. The election has to be about an idea of recovering an idea, in this case, that a president is not above the law, and of restoring what had been past gains on matters like the right to dissent and, of course, civil rights issues where there's been terrible retrenchment. So that's what the book's about. It's partly about how we recovered in the past, but it's not some prediction that it's inevitable that we'll recover in the future. It's a call, a hopeful call for recovery. So I look forward to questions and comments. Who'd like to go first? Wait for the mic.
It strikes me in that last example about Nixon that the actual impeachment charge about the Watergate break-in, you said, was not really the most substantially corrupt thing that he did. And then also in the case of the impeachment of Bill Clinton, many criticized that for however morally or just weird and gross that was and not appropriate. It had nothing to do necessarily with duties of the office except for maybe negligence or respect thereof. So it strikes me that maybe the way that we think about how to remove a president from office, especially with mechanism of impeachment, is less based on their actual disregard for their duties of office, but more so this a gimmick or having some kind of smoking gun, as you said, event happening. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, those are two good points. The first is, if we knew what happened during Nixon, we would not view the pardon the way that we do. And the pardon is usually thought of as, well, it moved the country forward. We're never going to have a president like this again. I think what it would have done if the pardon didn't come and the indictments were happened, where we would have had a moment where we saw not just the crime of Watergate, this sort of thing that's mocked on HBO as a bumbling break-in. And didn't everybody do things like this? Didn't everybody tap phones? You would have seen an attempt to kill a political opponent or incapacitate them, as the documents say. There's Ellsberg, that's the term he used. You would have seen the attempt to use the IRS to shut down political opponents. You would have seen, could have heard him on tape, which you could all hear because it's online now, him talking about, Henry Kissinger says to him, well, Mr. President, he thought there were documents, more of Ellsberg's documents in the safe of the Brookings Institution. This is speculation, but this is likely what it was that was getting him so incensed that he thought that what they showed was his agreement or attempt to reach the Vietcong, convinced him to delay the war until he was elected so that he could get a better deal. He obviously didn't want that coming out. So he orders this break-in, the Brookings Institution, safe. And Kissinger says, well, Mr. President, they shouldn't have those documents. We should go to court. And he says back, no, Henry, I want it done on a thievery basis. If you heard the president talking like that at the time, I think there would have been a very different reaction than the one that we've had. Now, what about Ken Starr, on the other hand? So that's the argument for prosecution. And then you say, rightly, wasn't Ken Starr an overzealous prosecutor? There's debate about that, but I'll say yes, I agree with that. And so the question, the way I've often put it is, what would we rather risk? An overzealous prosecutor like Ken Starr, who might be too strong in indicting a president who doesn't deserve it. And Starr did insist he had the right to indict Clinton, even though he didn't do it. Or risk a Richard Nixon or a Donald Trump, to be frankly about it. And the argument I've been giving is, I would definitely rather have 10 Ken Starrs than one Donald Trump who's able to get away with crime with impunity, because the stakes are totally different. The stakes of allowing a president to get away with crime are that you have Henry's warning come to life. That this office is so powerful that you have a criminal conspiracy within the White House able to use this vast power to essentially, I don't imagine Trump would say, hi, I'm a monarch, but he might say something close to it. In fact, he has said, I'm going to be a dictator on day one. That's the real risk, right? So, I'd say there is a risk if you bring back prosecution of the president of another Ken Starr, but it's much less of a risk than the risk of Richard Nixon or Donald Trump or John Adams.
Thank you so much for your wonderful and very hopeful lecture. But I wanted to ask about this notion of citizens that you were speaking about as having this ability to push back and resist. And it seems as if citizens have this ability as innate, as given, to go against this power grab. But I wanted to ask whether you see it as a constant or it can actually change, because the body of citizens is not monolith. The question that there are different divisions and who can build a hegemony. And if you speak about this particular historical context in which it seems that at least the vision of some sort of liberal democracy or the hegemony that driven the political imagination, whether we are still within the same horizon. And I speaking not about one political camps, but all political camps, whether there is still this vision that can drive this citizen. And moreover, there are also not only about the numbers and the majority of people thinking this way, but about abilities to mobilize. And it's not necessarily then goes the way that so thank you so much.
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's one that I think in the book I'm trying to be careful about. A, it might be that you don't get this citizen constituency. Or B, it doesn't necessarily have to be democratic. You sometimes have horrific instances, including the Oath Keepers, an example of that, of citizens who are joining forces with authoritarianism. Or, we could argue about this, or even fascism in a modern context. You look at what the Oath Keepers are saying. They're saying that we have an oath to the Constitution, which means that at all costs we need to support our leader, Donald Trump. That's it. It's a kind of straight authoritarianism. And of course, the leader of the Oath Keepers is actually a graduate of Yale Law School, and his followers, many of them are in prison as a result of their activities during January 6th in the attempted self-coup. And that is what January 6th is. That's what I try to argue in the book. This wasn't just a riot. It was an attempted destruction of democracy. So, yes, there's nothing about it. But it's a hopeful book, I think, because if you look at the context in which these people did act, these heroes, Sadie Alexander, the newspaper editors, Frederick Douglass, of course, I think, the most important actually among them. They were facing imprisonment. The editors were prosecuted. Douglass had to flee the United States. He was literally being hunted down by Buchanan. And yet they did it. They fought back. And not only did they fight back, but they won in the end. So, in political science, there's a tendency to find the check that works. And, I argue that that's deeply flawed, particularly the core of impeachment. And it would be flawed, too, to think that this is a mechanism of that sort, an inevitable check. But it's possible. That's what I'm trying to say. And it requires agency. It's not something that just happens.
Hey, Corey, thanks a lot for, good to see you too, man. I really enjoyed hearing you lay out the argument, and the narrative itself is just really compelling. I found myself on the edge of my seat, actually, a number of times in the arc of your description here. So I guess one comment and then a question. The comment is that I really found it so fascinating that you continue to go back to folks on the margins when it became important to work with these recovery presidents, that is, to recover that democratic idea of the Constitution. You noted Douglass, he was the star, and then there's Trotter and Ida B. Wells, Sadie Alexander, and Walter White, right? I mean, Black folks from, the margins of society who were so, and then Martin Luther King, who were so crucial in that. So I guess I want to say thanks for that, but also that links to maybe the question, which I think is connected to the previous question. In this moment of late modernity, when global corporate elites seem to benefit so much from unchecked presidential power because those presidents can, make their lives easier, is your opening for the kind of hope which in your story relies on, puts so much weight on folks on the margin who are now, again, in this historical moment in the U.S., already shouldering so much, is that hope, the sliver you give us, given the burdens on the people and the extraordinary benefits reaped by global corporate elites, is that sliver a mere thread or do you really see some possibility there? And if so, I'll maybe say a little bit more about that.
It's great. I mean, the first thing to say about it is I think it was, if you look at it in the context of those original presidents, the authoritarian presidents, it is less than a sliver at the time. That's what it looks like. And so in each of these examples, I mean, so go back to the first one, 1798, 1799. There are massive prosecutions happening throughout the United States of anyone who criticizes the president. And there are strategies for fighting back, but many of these people are in prison. And yet there's this continual handoff to say, we're not going to give up. It's incredible that they are, the idea that American democracy didn't completely collapse in 1798, I think is remarkable, because there was not just an attempt, but a successful shutdown of the opposition party, and yet people kept doing it. Now, why did they do it? It's because they had skin in the game, I think, not because they were, I think they just saw so clearly what it meant to shut down speech, and they were reporting on Adams and his flaws. They saw the election, attempt to steal the election. And so, it's extraordinary. Would you ask anybody, those editors, to have done that, or condemn them for not doing it? No, they could have easily pled guilty and gone home, and you think, okay, that made sense, and yet they did it. Douglas, extraordinary, again, right? He's literally being hunted by Buchanan and yet flees the country, and rather than just sort of hide out, he's speaking out not just against Buchanan, but against Lincoln. In the third case, before I get to Alexander, but in the case of Trotter, he thinks he's lost when he dies, and unfortunately, that's a huge part, I think, of the suicide, is the despondence that it's just impossible. And of course, we're talking about the long march took decades, and Ida B. Wells and Trotter neither of them saw it. So these aren't, things. Yeah, Boston. These aren't, things that you could expect of anyone, but yet the hope comes from over the trajectory over time that they work. And the point about the challenge now, I think the challenge was true then too. The president of the United States had a law on his side that allowed for him to imprison political opponents. That's not the case now. Buchanan had a court saying Black Americans were not people under the Constitution. So the odds were extraordinarily low of recovery then. Now, are they low now? I think, all the things that you say, it's frightening. And the immunity decision is frightening. And yet, that's the idea, that these past examples give hope. And this tradition, too, I think, part of what I'm trying to do, I think in some ways their victories are embedded in our consciousness, even if we don't, know the details of the story. And so we have a culture to fight back, to turn to. It's not, the editors and Douglas, they were really creating from scratch these constituencies in these cultures. So part of my hope, too, is that we have this other tradition to appeal to. I didn't talk about King because in some ways he's the most familiar, but think of the success of that, movement, in that there is a popular understanding of the Constitution that comes from Alexander, from Trotter, from Wells, and certainly from King. So, I think that's the hope too, and we've been fooled, right? We think that a president's not above the law. You hear that phrase all the time. U.S. versus Nixon was thought to be a defense of that idea, and yet it wasn't. Yet we could recover the principle. So, is it guaranteed? Definitely not. It's not a book that's meant to be naive and say, I think there's a good chance American democracy will collapse. This election, if Trump wins, it's going to take a long time to recover it. But is it inevitable? No. And if Trump doesn't win, I think then the possibilities really open up of something like the recovery presidency that I'm talking about. Biden, for a variety of reasons I could talk about, is at best a small partial recovery. It's not the kind of thing that I'm talking about, but there is a possibility. I've got.
That was actually the last question. If you have more questions for Professor Brettschneider, he's available on email. His book is actually for sale right outside right now. Feel free to reach out to him through email. And thank you all for coming.
Office hours, or thank you all for coming.
Yeah, thank you.